The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Laura Bennett pushed through the ICU doors at 6:19 a.m., her badge clipped to the left pocket of her scrubs next to a pen and a trauma shear she'd owned for 17 years. 6 months at Oak Creek Memorial. 183 days of moving through these hallways like water, present but unremarkable, her movements so economical they barely disturbed the air around her. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical bite of bleach and alcohol that never quite masked the copper underneath, the smell of bodies breaking down one cell at a time. She was early. Always early. The night shift nurse, Marcus, was still charting at the main station, his shoulders rounded from the midnight hours, his coffee cup empty for the third time. He glanced up as she approached, offered the kind of nod that acknowledged her existence without requiring conversation. That was fine. Laura preferred the spaces between words. "Status on Bay 4, she asked, keeping her voice steady and level. 14 months of night school. Civilian certifications. A nursing degree from Portland State purchased with a VA education benefit she'd had to carefully explain away. Nobody asked too many questions about the gaps in employment history when you showed up on time and worked doubles without complaint." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "Training accident admitted at 2,100 yesterday. Navy guy, some kind of SEAL. His name's in the system as Reeves. Docs think he aspirated water during a dive scenario, went hypoxic for maybe 45 seconds before they pulled him out. He's stable now, but he was pretty confused when he came in. Still on light morphine for the pulmonary irritation. A SEAL." The word landed in her chest like a reminder she didn't ask for. Laura nodded once, kept her expression neutral, the way she'd learned to do 7 years ago when the Navy ordered her to disappear. "Oxygen levels? 94 to 96. Lungs are clearing. Should be discharged in another week if there are no complications." Marcus signed off on his charting. "He's in and out of sleep. Probably won't give you much trouble." Laura moved through the ICU with the kind of practiced efficiency that looked casual to anyone watching. But efficiency born from habit never looks like hurrying. It looks like a person who knows exactly where every piece of equipment lives, how many steps between stations, which monitors need adjustment before they alarm, which patients need the light dimmed because the morphine makes their pupils reactive. She'd learned this rhythm in field hospitals under canvas with IED wounded bleeding into her hands. She'd learned it in Sanjin Valley where the electricity was unreliable and you had to know your surroundings the way a hunter knows the forest. Bay 4 was on the eastern wall, curtain drawn, machines casting that familiar blue-green glow across the space. Laura pushed the curtain aside with 2 fingers, stepped into the room, and let her eyes run the tactical scan. She still performed entry points, equipment locations, exits, the patient's position relative to the door. The scan took less than 2 seconds. It looked like a nurse glancing around before starting her shift. Commander James Reeves lay in the hospital bed with his right arm outside the covers, his wrist resting on a pillow to keep the fall line from crimping. He was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady, his chest rising and falling beneath the cardiac monitor leads. Mid-40s, maybe. That lean, carved appearance of someone who'd spent 2 decades running toward things that wanted him dead. His face was relaxed in sleep, the tension gone from his jaw, and for a moment Laura allowed herself to look at him, really look at him, before she moved to the monitor and began her assessment. The vital signs were stable. Temperature 98.2. Heart rate 68. Oxygen saturation 95%. Blood pressure 134/82. Everything in the green zone. She noted the numbers in her mind, the way she'd been trained to do. Data was information, information was survival. She was reaching for his wrist to check his pulse when she saw it. His right forearm. The tattoo. It was dark blue-black ink, faded the way tattoos fade when you've carried them for 7 years in sun and salt and the kind of salt sweat that comes from knowing you might die before sunset. The letters were in a script that sloped slightly, professionally done by someone who knew military ink. Her name? Laura. Not a common tattoo for a man to wear. Names required stories, and stories required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the opposite of everything the Navy trained SEALs to be. Her breath caught. Just once. Just barely. But it happened. She stood there for 3 seconds, long enough to notice the scar tissue on his knuckles, the way his calloused fingers lay flat against the sheet, the small pale scar on his collarbone that matched the one she remembered from Sanjin. 7 years ago. A shrapnel wound from the same IED that had taken out half his convoy. She'd been the first medic to reach him, her hands already moving before her brain caught up, applying pressure to the wound, assessing the damage, making the split-second calculus between what he needed and what she could do in a firefight. She'd saved his life that day. Dragged him across 40 meters of open ground while rounds kicked up dirt around them, while his blood soaked into her sleeves, while the medevac bird came screaming in hot enough to shake the earth. She'd tagged his wrist with a casualty marker, green, walking wounded, stable for transport, and turned to the next body. Now he slept in a hospital bed in Portland, Oregon, and had no idea she existed. Laura took his wrist, her fingers finding the pulse point with muscle memory so deep it felt like breathing. Radial artery. Strong. 88 beats per minute. His skin was warm, the pulse steady and sure beneath her fingertips. She counted the beats without moving her face. Her hands had held lives together in the dark. Her hands had done things that the government said never happened. Her hands had been trained to kill and trained to save and trained never to tremble. She didn't tremble now. Instead, she made notes. Vital stable. Respiratory effort minimal. Level of consciousness good during assessment. She checked the 4-line, confirmed it was running clear fluid, just saline and electrolytes, nothing aggressive, and adjusted the monitor leads where one had started to slip. Her movements were automatic, practiced, the kind of movements that looked unremarkable to anyone watching. A nurse doing her job. Just a nurse, as one of the residents had said during her first week. It's good to have another body, even if it's just a nurse. She was checking the fluid bag when Reeves's eyes opened. They were grey-blue, the kind of eyes that had seen things that changed the architecture of a person's brain. The morphine made them unfocused, swimming slightly as his consciousness fought through the chemical fog. She saw him try to place her, saw the effort it took, saw the moment his brain decided it was too much work and retreated back into the medication's embrace. "Water," he murmured, his voice rough from intubation. "Let me adjust the bed," Laura said. Her voice was calm, professional, measured. It was the voice of someone who'd never worn a rank, never carried a weapon, never heard the sound of your own hands doing triage under fire. Small sips first. She elevated the head of the bed, helped him find the cup, held it steady while he drank. His fingers brushed hers as he took the cup. She didn't pull away. The moment passed. He closed his eyes again, the morphine pulling him back under, and she stood there holding the empty cup, her heartbeat exactly where it should be. 72 beats per minute. Steady as a drumbeat. That was what combat training gave you, the ability to compartmentalize, to file away the unexpected, to keep functioning while everything inside you was screaming. She'd learned to file away the letter from the Navy. She'd learned to file away the discharge that never officially happened. She'd learned to file away the fact that 3 colonels from the Pentagon had personally ensured that Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett ceased to exist in any official capacity, that her service records were sealed, that her name was removed from every database that mattered. She'd learned to live in the new space they'd created for her. Civilian. Invisible. Just a nurse. The next mini cliffhanger came at 7:15 a.m. when Dr. Hargrove entered the ICU. The hospital was waking up now, nurses changing shifts, day staff filtering in, the machine starting to sing their complex chorus. Laura was in the medication room, documenting her counts, when she heard the particular quality of silence that meant someone important had arrived. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of sound. The way a room changes its pressure when authority walks through the door. She didn't look up from her documentation. She'd learned long ago that looking up too quickly, too eagerly, made people notice you. Instead, she continued writing, her pen moving with the same meticulous precision that had gotten her through nursing school, every detail recorded, every medication accounted for, every action that could be challenged later defended by the evidence of her own careful hand. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway of the medication room like a man who'd learned to occupy space as a form of power. Expensive shoes. A tie that probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent. A watch on his left wrist that caught the fluorescent light, gold, probably real, definitely unnecessary in a hospital where you had to wash your hands every 90 seconds. He was in his late 50s, maybe, with the kind of build that came from believing the expensive gym membership was a substitute for actual discipline. "Bennett," he said, and made it sound like a question. "You're the new ICU intake, correct?" 6 months, Laura said. She kept her eyes on her documentation. Still learning the hospital's protocols. Right. She could feel him move into the medication room, could sense the particular gravity that men like him carried, the gravity of someone who'd never had to question whether he belonged somewhere. The Navy SEAL in Bay 4. "Reeves. I'll be managing his care going forward. I need meticulous charting on that patient. Every vital sign, every medication, every time you adjust his position." "Understood." "Of course, Doctor. I'm particular about protocol." His voice had the edge of something sharp, something that wanted to cut. "I trust that won't be an issue for you." Laura turned the page in her med log. "No issue, Doctor." He stood in the doorway for another 3 seconds, long enough for her to feel the weight of his attention, long enough for her to understand that this man had noticed her in some way that mattered. Then he left, his shoes clicking against the linoleum in that way expensive shoes do when they're walking away from something they've already decided to own. She documented the remainder of her medications with the same meticulous attention she'd always used. Every line filled in completely. Every number double-checked. Every action recorded in a way that couldn't be misinterpreted or challenged. It was a habit from the field. You documented because documentation was survival, because it created a record that existed outside of anyone's memory or intention. She'd been documenting like this for 7 years, in every hospital where she'd worked, waiting for something that never came. Now, watching Commander Reeves sleep in Bay 4, she began to wonder if the waiting was finally over. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, the soft hiss of the oxygen concentrator, the distant sound of a helicopter passing overhead. Laura's hands went still for just a moment, muscle memory of a different kind, the sound that meant danger was passing, help was coming, you could breathe for another second. She closed her eyes, counted to 4, and returned to her work. The staff lounge at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like stale coffee and ambition the wrong kind. Dr. Hargrove stood by the sink during shift change, his voice pitched to carry across the entire room, loud enough that every resident, every med student, every nurse within 20 feet could hear him clearly. "I'm telling you, this Bennett is done in a week," he said, stirring sugar into his cup with deliberate slowness. 1 week, maximum. This mousy little thing doesn't have the spine for emergency work. I've seen her type before, they crack under pressure, go running home to their cats or whatever. He laughed, and 3 residents laughed with him, the sound of hyenas testing the perimeter. Laura stood 6 feet away at the coffee station, her hand steady as she poured dark roast into a paper cup. She took one measured breath. The bet landed like a stone in still water, and she watched the ripples spread. One resident glanced at her. Then another looked away. Hargrove kept talking, kept smiling, the architect of the moment he was creating. She didn't flinch. She didn't look back. She simply added 1 sugar, 1 cream, and walked out with the cup warming her palms. But that wasn't the worst part. The following afternoon in the cafeteria, Laura sat alone with a garden salad and iced tea, her eyes on the medical journal open beside her tray. She was reading about a new protocol for tension pneumothorax management when Hargrove approached from her blind side. He moved with the careless grace of someone who'd never had to think about consequences, carrying his lunch tray like it was a prop in a play only he understood. He paused beside her table. Didn't speak. Just bumped the tray against the edge with his elbow, a movement too deliberate to be accidental, too casual to be provable. Her salad exploded across the table. Coffee cascaded onto the floor with a sound like breaking glass hitting tile. "Oh, so clumsy of me," Hargrove said, not looking down, his tone dripping with a contempt so thick you could operate in it. He stepped over the spill and walked away, leaving her kneeling on the linoleum. Other staff members froze mid-conversation, their forks suspended, their eyes darting away from her like they'd witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Laura knelt to clean the mess, gathering the shattered pieces of her salad bowl with trembling hands, not trembling from fear. Trembling from something else. Something older. Something that had watched men die in the sand and learned the difference between weakness and restraint. When she stood, one tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it if he was still watching from the exit. Then she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with her reflection in the cafeteria window and whispered in a voice steady as a blade, "I've carried heavier things than your ego, Doctor." The woman at the next table looked up. Stared. Said nothing. That evening during rounds, Hargrove stood at Commander Reeves's bedside with 2 residents and a medical student clustered around him like satellites around a dying star. Laura entered with her medication cart, ready to adjust the SEAL's pain management. Hargrove didn't even glance at her. He simply picked up Reeves's patient chart from the bedside table, held it for 3 seconds, then threw it at her feet with a flick of his wrist. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "Let's see if you can actually read a chart without needing me to explain every single thing." The 2 residents exchanged glances. The med student looked at the floor. Hargrove smirked, waiting for the moment when she would break, when she would apologize, when she would confirm every word of his bet. Laura bent down and retrieved the chart. Her movements were controlled. Precise. The kind of precise that comes from muscle memory, from years of operating under conditions where hesitation meant someone didn't go home. She straightened and opened the chart, her eyes moving across the medication orders with the speed of someone who'd memorized medical protocols the way other people memorize prayer. There. Second page. Morphine dosage ordered at 12 milligrams every 4 hours for a man who weighed 187 pounds. The calculation was wrong by exactly half. The standard dose would be 6 milligrams. At 12, within 4 hours Reeves would be in respiratory arrest, his breathing so shallow the monitors would flatline like a dead man's heartbeat. She didn't say anything aloud. She simply closed the chart, returned it to the bedside table, and walked back to her medication cart. Hargrove's smile faltered slightly when she didn't challenge him, didn't question him, didn't give him the confrontation he was building toward. She accessed the hospital system on the portable computer attached to her cart, pulled up Reeves's medication orders, and adjusted the morphine dose to 6 milligrams. Then she opened her personal log on her personal laptop, a notebook she kept at home, and documented the discrepancy in meticulous detail. The third one in 2 weeks. The third piece of evidence she was quietly assembling without understanding yet why the pattern mattered. What she didn't know was that Hargrove had already made his calls. One to Marcus Sterling, a board member who'd gotten his son into an exclusive country club on Hargrove's recommendation. One to the HR director he'd personally selected for her position 4 years ago, a woman who understood the debt of patronage the way other people understood breathing. He'd asked them simple questions: how quickly could they move? How thoroughly could they bury a personnel file? What would it take to make someone simply disappear from the hospital roster? Performance concerns, he'd told Sterling. Insubordination. Safety violations. We'll document it as we go. By next week, she'll be escorted out, and there won't be a single question about severance. Sterling had laughed on the other end of the line. The woman who questioned those supply orders. The same, Hargrove had confirmed. That night, Laura changed into her scrubs for the night shift and arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 11 p.m. sharp, the summer air still warm even as the sun disappeared behind the Cascade Mountains. She swiped her badge at the staff entrance and headed toward the ICU, her mind already running through the patient updates, the medications, the vitals that needed monitoring. But when she reached the nursing station, the charge nurse, an older woman named Patricia who'd never quite made eye contact with her, handed her a printed memo. "You're reassigned," Patricia said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Starting tonight. Psychiatric wing, 7th floor. Dr. Hargrove's order." Laura read the memo. It cited performance concerns and evaluation period. Her hand didn't shake as she held the paper. Her voice didn't rise as she asked, "Did he say why?" No details provided, Patricia said, and now she did look at Laura, and there was something like pity in her expression. "I'm sorry. I just deliver the messages." Laura folded the memo and placed it in her pocket. She requested permission to finish charting her current ICU patients to make sure her transition was clean, no loose ends that could compromise care. Patricia nodded and told her she had until the end of shift. Hargrove appeared in the hallway at 10:45 p.m., freshly showered, clearly on his way out. Laura was at the nursing station, updating medication logs. He saw her there and changed direction. "You got the reassignment notice," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, doctor," she replied without looking up. "Good. I want you off this unit immediately. Don't finish charting. Don't finish anything. You can leave your login information with Patricia and walk to the elevators." Laura set down her pen. Turned to face him. "My patients need. Your patients need competent care, which means they need you gone. Psych unit 7. Now. It's not a request, Nurse Bennett. It's an order." He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no and expected never to be. Laura sat very still for a moment. Then she returned to her charting. Finished it. Every note. Every observation. Every medication adjustment she'd made. Every instinct she'd followed that kept those 6 patients breathing steady and alive. She documented the morphine correction she'd made to Commander Reeves's orders. She noted his oxygen saturation trending down slightly, something the monitors wouldn't catch for hours. She flagged his chart for close observation. By the time she finished, it was 11:22 p.m. At 11:59 p.m., an alarm shattered the ICU silence, the sound of a monitor screaming code blue from Bay 4. Laura was 40 feet down the hallway, walking toward the elevator that would take her to the psych unit, when she heard it. The alarm cut through the darkness like lightning, and something in its pitch made her turn back. She shouldn't. She'd been explicitly ordered to leave. She had no authority here anymore. The night shift attendant was already moving toward the room, and the on-call resident, a first-year named Dr. Chen, was rushing in from the break room. But she turned back anyway. Commander James Reeves's room was chaos-dressed in fluorescent light. Dr. Chen stood frozen at the bedside, staring at the monitor where Reeves's oxygen saturation was crashing, 96, 92, 88, 84, his chest hyperinflating on one side, his breathing turning desperate and shallow, his lips beginning to pale. The SEAL's eyes were wide, morphine-dulled and terrified, his body thrashing against the restraints that kept his central line secure. "Get the attending," Dr. Chen stammered. "I need to call the attending. We need protocol, we need authorization." "You need a 14-gauge needle in the next 60 seconds, Laura said quietly, moving into the room without being invited. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Or his heart stops in 90. Dr. Chen turned to her with the expression of someone drowning. "You don't have. Call respiratory. Get me a needle. Now, doctor, or you'll be doing chest compressions on a SEAL while I explain to his commanding officer why you hesitated." Her voice dropped an octave. Her posture shifted. Something in her presence made the air pressure change, and Dr. Chen moved without further argument, reaching for the crash cart, shouting for respiratory over the intercom. Laura's hands didn't shake. She'd done this before. She'd done this in sandstorms. She'd done this with incoming fire and no anesthesia and a man bleeding out in her arms who'd somehow survived anyway. She palpated Reeves's chest, feeling for the landmarks, finding them by muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought, the second rib, the space beneath it, the exact point where air was crushing his lung into a useless collapsed thing. Reeves's eyes found hers, and for just a moment, something flickered across his expression. Recognition hovering just below consciousness. The ghost of a memory that couldn't quite surface through the morphine and terror. Respiratory arrived with a cart. A nurse handed Laura the needle. And across the hospital, in his office on the 5th floor, Dr. Hargrove hung up his phone after speaking to the private investigator. Laura Bennett's employment history before 6 months ago essentially doesn't exist, the investigator had reported. No prior references. No verifiable work history. No permanent address. It's like she appeared out of nowhere. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, smiling. Perfect, he'd said. That's exactly what I needed. What happened next would unravel everything. The reassignment notice arrived on Laura's assigned computer the morning after she'd corrected Commander Reeves's chart. Dr. Hargrove's signature sat at the bottom of the memo in ink that looked almost polite. Effective immediately, Laura Bennett would be transferring to the psychiatric wing's night rotation. Performance concerns, the memo stated. Need for staff flexibility. Standard operational procedure. She read it 3 times, standing alone in the break room at 6:51 a.m., the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air like a marker of every shift that had come before this one. The psychiatric wing. Where patients came for trauma, depression, suicidal ideation. Important work. Necessary work. But not ICU work. Not the work that required the kind of precision she'd spent 17 years perfecting in places where every breath mattered because sometimes there was no second chance to take it. Laura folded the memo and slipped it into her jacket pocket, where her fingertips found the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the only physical proof of her service that the Navy had let her keep. She pressed it once, the worn fabric barely textured under her touch, then released it and returned to her shift. The first chance she had, Laura checked her personnel file in the HR database. 6 pages of incident reports, all dated within the last week. All attributed to her name. Supply order inquiries flagged as questioning institutional judgment. The medication correction on Reeves's chart marked as acting outside scope of practice. The lunch tray incident, reframed, Laura had failed to acknowledge supervisor feedback during staff development moment. Not knocked. Not thrown. Feedback. Development. The language of bureaucracy smoothing violence into policy. And there, buried in the digital architecture, chronic insubordination regarding vendor protocols, demonstrates pattern of institutional distrust. That's what Hargrove had written about her asking questions. 2 simple questions about why equipment orders for the ICU had tripled in cost while the equipment specifications remained identical. Just questions. Professional due diligence. The kind of observation that should have been noted in a memo to supply chain. Instead, it was evidence of her fundamental unsuitability. She read each entry without reaction, her breath measured, her jaw unclenched. This was the game now. This was what happened when you noticed things you weren't supposed to notice and asked questions in a system designed to reward silence. Hargrove wasn't just punishing her for knowing about the kickback scheme. He was documenting her as unstable. Creating a paper trail so detailed that when the real move came, and it would come, no one would question it. Laura closed the file and clocked out at 7:15 a.m., the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in that sterile blue-white that made the world look like a place where nothing could ever be truly clean. That night, she was assigned to cover an ICU shift when Dr. Chen called in sick, a rotation the psychiatric wing hadn't yet locked her into. Laura didn't question why she was still on the ICU rotation board. She just went where she was scheduled. She understood systems. She understood that chaos in staffing matrices was sometimes the only thing that kept someone like her alive in an institution like this. Commander Reeves was asleep when she checked on him at 10:56 p.m., his breathing steady beneath the pulse oximeter that beeped its reassuring rhythm, 96% oxygen saturation, normal rate, normal rhythm. The pain medication had pulled him into the kind of sleep that looked peaceful because the body finally believed it was safe. His hand still lay on top of the bedding, the tattoo visible in the sterile light. Her name. 7 years in his skin. She wondered sometimes if the tattoo represented survival or debt. Maybe they were the same thing. By 11:02 p.m., everything changed. His breathing became desperate, shallow, rapid, the kind of breathing that meant the body was fighting for oxygen and losing. Laura was at his bedside in 3 strides. His chest had begun to hyperinflate, expanding with each desperate breath but not deflating properly. The textbook signs screamed themselves at her, tension pneumothorax. Air had entered the pleural space, and with each breath he took, more air got trapped, pressing against his lungs, collapsing them, pushing his heart sideways in his chest until the vessels wouldn't fill. She hit the call button and had her stethoscope on his chest before the first responding nurse appeared in the doorway. No breath sounds on the left side. Nothing. Just the silence where air should have been moving. His oxygen saturation was dropping, 94, 92, 88, the numbers falling like a countdown to something terrible. "Get Dr. Chen," Laura said, her voice level. "Or whoever's covering." The nurse, a travel staffing float named Marcus, nodded and disappeared. Laura watched the monitor. The numbers kept falling. 85, 82. Reeves's eyes flew open, panic flooding them, his hand reaching for her sleeve. His mouth moved but nothing came out except the sound of someone suffocating. "I've got you," Laura said. Just those 4 words. She'd said them before to other men in other countries under other kinds of sky, and they'd been lies sometimes and truth other times, and the line between them had blurred so completely that she'd stopped trying to distinguish. Dr. Chen appeared at the doorway 4 minutes later, out of breath from running, his face already showing the architecture of panic. He was young, 32, maybe 33, and capable, but capability meant nothing when the brain went white with fear. Laura watched his eyes move across the monitor, watched the realization creep in that something was very wrong, and watched him freeze. "What's happening?" he asked, and the question wasn't rhetorical. "Tension pneumothorax," Laura said. "He needs needle decompression now." "Do we have a crash cart?" Yes. Dr. Chen didn't move toward it. The room was collecting people now. 2 more nurses. A resident who'd been in the building. All of them watching the numbers fall. 80, 77. Reeves's hand gripped Laura's wrist with surprising strength, his eyes locked onto hers with a kind of desperation that came from drowning in air. Laura released his hand, walked to the crash cart, and selected a 14-gauge angiocath needle without hesitation. Her movements had the fluid precision of muscle memory activated. "I'm going to perform the decompression," she said. Not a question. Not a request. The voice that said it wasn't the voice of a nurse reassigned to psychiatry. It was a different voice. Older. Harder. The voice of someone who'd made decisions in desert dust and mortar fire. "You can't," Dr. Chen started. His hypoxic and crashing. "You're the physician. You can supervise and document, or you can continue standing there." Laura was already prepping the site, 2nd and 3rd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the same coordinates she'd learned in a military classroom 18 years ago. She cleaned the area with an iodine swab, the smell of antiseptic rising sharp and clean. Document everything. Exact procedure, exact time, exact vital sign progression. Dr. Chen moved. His hands shook as he began recording into a voice memo, but at least he was moving. The other nurses gathered around. The resident pulled up a chair, whether for support or to sit down from shock, Laura couldn't tell. She inserted the needle between Reeves's ribs with the same deliberation she'd used 1,000 times before. The skin resisted for half a second. Then the needle slipped through the parietal pleura, and the trapped air hissed out like a held breath finally released. The sound filled the room, the hiss of escaping pressure, the sound of everything shifting back into balance. "Oxygen saturation climbing," one of the nurses called out. 88, 90, 92. Reeves gasped, a real breath, a full breath, air actually reaching his lungs. His body went rigid for a moment and then relaxed, his hand falling from Laura's wrist. The monitors beeped their recalibration, heart rate dropping from 142 to 118 to 105. Oxygen saturation at 96 and holding steady. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered, as if they'd witnessed something miraculous. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that changed everything. That was just medicine. That was just a procedure performed under pressure by someone trained to perform it. What came next was the part that mattered, the part that Hargrove had been waiting for. Laura removed the needle and secured a chest tube, her movements automatic and precise. She knew the wound management. She knew the monitoring. She knew what came after, the paperwork, the documentation, the bureaucracy that would swallow this moment and decide what it meant. Document that the attending resident supervised the entire procedure, she said to Dr. Chen. Every second of it. Vital signs. Timing. Oxygen progression. Everything. She looked at him once, straight on. Make it detailed. Make it clear I didn't move until it was necessary and the supervision was apparent. Dr. Chen's eyes filled with something, recognition, maybe. Understanding that he was being given instructions on how to protect her. I'll get it written up before I leave, he said. Laura nodded and checked Reeves's pupils. Responsive. Alert. His eyes were open now, looking at her with an intensity that made her understand something had shifted. His hand reached for her sleeve again, but this time it wasn't panic. His mouth formed words, I know you. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she adjusted the oxygen flow and stepped back, and that's when she heard the pages being transmitted through the hospital's overhead speaker, calling Dr. Hargrove to the administrative conference room. 3 times his name was called. 3 times his location was requested. It was 6:23 a.m., and she understood, without being told, without seeing the evidence, that the moment had shifted again. The move was coming. The monitor's alarm cut through the ICU like a blade. 2:19 a.m. Commander Reeves's oxygen saturation was collapsing, 68% and dropping. His breathing had turned desperate, each inhaler fight against pressure building in his chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung trapping air between the lung tissue and the chest wall, compressing his heart with every breath. The on-call resident stood frozen 3 feet away, his eyes wide, his hands hanging useless at his sides. He was reviewing the chest X-ray on the monitor, the one that should have shown the problem hours ago, and his face had gone the color of old gauze. Laura didn't wait for him to move. She didn't wait for permission or protocol or someone to call it out loud. Her hands were already moving, muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than her civilian identity, reaching for the crash cart beside Bay 4. The 14-gauge angiocath needle was in her palm before conscious thought caught up to instinct. Steel cool against her skin. The weight of it felt like coming home. Step back, she said to the resident. Not a request. Not soft. The kind of command that made people move without thinking, and he did, his body retreating 3 steps like he'd been physically pushed. The chief nursing officer was already there, summoned by the alarm, standing in the doorway with a phone in one hand and concern darkening her face. I'm calling, she started. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, Laura interrupted, her voice steady as a surgeon's hands. She was already moving into position, her left hand locating the space between Reeves's ribs with the precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorms while rounds kicked up dust clouds and mortars shook the ground beneath her feet. Her fingers found the landmarks. Muscle memory. Data. Pain was information, and her body remembered everything. The needle went in. One smooth motion. No hesitation. No tremor. The hiss of air escaping was louder than the monitor. That single sound, the pneumatic release of pressure that had been crushing a man's heart, was the entire story of his survival compressed into 2 seconds. Reeves gasped. His chest expanded. The tightness released like a hand unclenching. O2 sat rising, the chief nursing officer whispered, her voice carrying the kind of awe that comes from watching something you know should be impossible happen anyway. 72, 78. 84. Laura secured the catheter. Step back. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. There was no recognition in her face that she'd just saved a man's life for the second time, no flicker of awareness that she'd crossed a line she wasn't supposed to cross, no hesitation in the movements that had just executed a procedure that required combat medic training and 7 years of active deployment experience. The resident found his voice somewhere near the floor. I was going to call for the attending. You were going to call, Laura said quietly, and he was going to code before the attending arrived. She looked at him once, flat and final, and turned to the vital signs monitor. Sinus rhythm. Perfusion stable. He needs a chest tube from cardiothoracics, but his breathing. By 6:19 a.m., 4 hours after the procedure, 2 hours after the cardiothoracic team placed a proper surgical tube and confirmed the decompression had worked, Laura was sitting in the break room filling out the incident report when her charge nurse, Deshonda, appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested she'd been sent to deliver bad news and hated every second of it. Hargrove's looking for you, Deshonda said, not quite meeting her eyes. He's on the phone. Conference room. Now. Laura set down her pen. She'd known this was coming. Not the specifics, she didn't yet know about the 3 calls Hargrove had made, the conversations with the board member who owed him a country club favor, the HR director he'd personally placed in her position 5 years ago, the private investigator with his phone and his suspicious questions about why Laura Bennett's employment history was so suspiciously sparse. But she knew the structure of retaliation. She knew how institutions protected themselves. She knew how men like Hargrove weaponized rules and policy and the appearance of protocol against people who saw things they shouldn't see. She walked down the hallway. Her badge felt heavy against her sternum. The unit patch was still pressed against her ribs, hidden inside her jacket lining, a secret that pressed like a stone. The conference room door was closed. Hargrove was inside, along with the hospital administrator and someone from HR, a woman named Patricia whose job it was to deliver terminations with a sympathetic face and a box of tissues. All 3 of them were sitting on one side of the table, a configuration that left no question about which side of this meeting Laura was expected to be on. Laura, the administrator began, his voice carrying the rehearsed gentleness of someone about to destroy someone else's livelihood. Please sit. She didn't sit. She stood at the end of the table, her posture loose and open, her face the same neutral mask she'd worn for 6 months in this hospital. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man holding a winning hand. Your actions last night constituted a serious violation of scope of practice. You administered a medical procedure, a needle decompression, without physician authorization. That's a felony in Oregon, Laura. That's the loss of your nursing license. The administrator cleared his throat. We've reviewed the incident report. The procedure was appropriate, medically, it was the correct choice, but the protocol requires a physician to authorize the procedure, Patricia finished smoothly. Even if that physician is frozen. Even if that physician is incompetent. Especially then, actually. She didn't smile, but her tone suggested she'd rehearsed these words with Hargrove, tested them, found them bulletproof. We can't have nurses making independent decisions, no matter how well-intentioned. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. We'll be terminating your employment for practicing outside your scope without physician authorization. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You'll surrender your badge and access card. Laura absorbed this without flinching. No heat in her face. No trembling in her hands. Just the cold clarity that came from knowing the rules of this game and understanding that she'd lost because the game had been rigged from the moment she'd walked into this hospital 6 months ago and Dr. Hargrove had decided she was a threat. I understand, she said. You can pick up your personal belongings. Patricia will oversee. I said I understand, Doctor. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens in field hospitals right after a patient stops bleeding, the absence of crisis, the presence of aftermath. Hargrove's jaw tightened slightly, a muscle flickering at the corner of his mouth. He'd wanted her to fight. Had wanted tears or anger or desperation. The flat acceptance of her own destruction was somehow worse to him than any defiance would have been. 40 minutes later, Marcus, the veteran security guard who worked the ground floor entrance, the one with the Silver Star medal folded away in a box at home and the prosthetic right leg he never talked about, escorted her to her locker. He handed her a cardboard box. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would draw attention. Inside were her stethoscope, coiled and sealed, a framed photo of Daniel from last year, her jacket with the patch she'd kept hidden in the lining since the day she'd arrived. Marcus met her eyes for one long second. He'd seen the incident report before Hargrove had. Everyone had. Everyone knew what she'd done and why. And in that single second of eye contact, he offered her the only form of acknowledgement that was safe to give, quiet recognition from one person who'd served to another. "I'm sorry, Senior Chief," he said softly, so quiet nobody else would hear it. She took the box. "Not your fault, Marcus." "I know. But I'm sorry anyway." The Portland rain was falling when she walked out of Oak Creek Memorial at 12:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, carrying the box that contained the evidence of her erasure. The sky was the color of old concrete. Water ran off the building's eaves in steady rivers. She didn't go home. Didn't call Daniel. Didn't call anyone. Instead, her feet carried her for blocks east, through downtown Portland's afternoon crowds, down Morrison Avenue toward the VA hospital where she'd treated her first wounded warrior 15 years ago in a field hospital that no longer existed and wouldn't be listed on any map. The waiting room was exactly as it always was, chairs filled with the kinds of faces that had seen things they couldn't unsee. A Marine with a German Shepherd service dog sat against the far wall, the dog's head alert beneath the handler vest. An Army Ranger with a prosthetic leg below the knee waited for his appointment, his crutches leaning against the chair beside him like a promise he kept to himself every single day. A Navy corpsman with the same hollow look Laura saw in her own mirror every morning sat filling out forms with the kind of mechanical precision that came from having filled out too many forms before. Laura sat down in an empty chair between the Ranger and an older vet whose name tag identified him as Vietnam era, his hand shaking slightly as he read a magazine he wasn't looking at. Nobody made eye contact. That was the rule in waiting rooms like this. You Saturday. You waited. You didn't acknowledge the weight of what you were all carrying. A young woman in hospital scrubs at the intake window handed Laura a clipboard. "New patient packet," she said pleasantly, not knowing that the woman taking it was Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett with 2 Purple Hearts and a Navy Cross and the kind of clearance that had been classified so thoroughly that the Pentagon had ordered her own existence erased. Not knowing that the hands taking the clipboard had held wounded warriors through enemy fire, had performed emergency surgery in a truck bed under IED attack, had carried people through darkness toward light. Laura looked down at the form. Name. Date of birth. Address. Previous medical history, the part where she could only write the abbreviations her cover story allowed. Previous psychiatric history, none listed. Military service, classified. Reason for visit, depression. Anxiety. Intrusive thoughts. Sleep disturbance. The words were all true. They were also all lies. She was halfway through the form when her fingers found the unit patch through her jacket lining. The faded cloth. The emblem that meant something only to people who'd worn the same one. She pressed it once, hard, the way someone might press a panic button or a prayer. What she didn't know, Commander James Reeves was in the ICU recovery wing for miles away, drifting in and out of consciousness after his emergency surgery, repeating her name with increasing urgency to the nurses who kept telling him to rest. He was insisting that the woman who'd saved him was the medic from San Jin. The one with the Navy Cross. The one they told him was killed in action. Find her, he kept saying, gripping the nurse's hands. You have to find her. She's real. She's alive. What Laura also didn't know, Dr. Hargrove's private investigator had finally called back with his report, the one confirming that Laura Bennett's background was impossibly clean, no childhood records, no college transcripts, nothing before her nursing certification 6 years ago. The kind of background that screamed federal erasure. Classified operation. Buried service record. Hargrove had made one final call that morning to a contact in naval personnel, fishing for leverage, finding none, discovering only that Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett didn't exist in any database he could access. And what neither of them knew, Daniel Bennett was standing in his mother's bedroom holding the lockbox she'd forbidden him to touch since they'd moved to Portland, her termination letter on the bed beside him, his face set with the kind of teenage righteousness that doesn't understand the concept of rules designed to protect you from the truth. He pulled out his phone. He found the number for Oak Creek Memorial's administration office. His voice was steady as he dialed, steady as someone picked up, steady as he said the words that would change everything. My name is Daniel Bennett. I need to report that you just fired a decorated Navy war hero. The VA hospital waiting room smelled like industrial floor wax and broken promises. Laura sat in a plastic chair that squeaked every time she shifted her weight, a clipboard trembling slightly in her hands as she filled out intake forms that asked for employment history she could no longer claim. Around her, men and women in various states of recovery filled the other seats, a Marine with a prosthetic left leg reading a 3-month-old magazine, a soldier whose 1,000-yard stare suggested his wounds ran deeper than skin, a veteran Laura had treated in a field hospital in Helmand Province 8 years ago, before everything was classified and erased. He didn't recognize her. That was the point. That had always been the point. 3 days. 72 hours since security had handed her a cardboard box containing her personal effects and a termination letter citing practicing outside the scope of nursing licensure without physician authorization. 3 days of silence. 3 days of her son Daniel asking questions she couldn't answer. 3 days of staring at the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only proof of her service she'd kept, pressing against her ribs like a secret she'd been ordered to take to her grave. The waiting room door opened with a pneumatic hiss. Daniel stood there, 17 years old and wearing the kind of fierce expression that looked borrowed from someone much older, carrying a lockbox she'd explicitly forbidden him to touch. His jaw was set the same way hers went set when she was about to do something irreversible. Behind him, the afternoon rain hammered the windows like applause. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the waiting room. "They need to see these." He held up the lockbox like evidence. Laura's stomach dropped. She set down her clipboard. The trembling that had followed her for 3 days stopped. Replaced by something else. Muscle memory. The calm that comes from recognizing you've just crossed a threshold you can't walk back across. Laura stood. She didn't ask how he'd gotten the lockbox. She didn't ask what he was planning. She simply gathered her jacket, thanked the receptionist for the forms she hadn't finished, and followed her son out into the Portland rain. 20 minutes later, Laura sat in a hospital conference room at Oak Creek Memorial while Daniel placed her medals on the polished table one by one. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. Silver Star. Navy Cross. Each medal caught the overhead light like small accusations. The chief nursing officer, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd hired Laura 6 months ago and had watched the entire Hargrove situation unfold with visible guilt, picked up the service file Daniel had brought. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of reading words that fundamentally contradicted the official record she'd been told existed. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Patricia read aloud, her voice steadying with each word. Deployed to Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. 3 combat tours. Promoted to Senior Chief following the extraction of 5 wounded SEALs under sustained enemy fire. Patricia looked up, her eyes wet. The documentation says your service records were sealed by Naval Special Warfare Command. That your file was classified and your civilian employment status was mandated. The room went quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. Daniel stood next to his mother with his arms crossed, 17 years old and bearing the weight of having forced his mother's hand. The door opened. Commander Reeves rolled himself into the conference room in a wheelchair he'd only be using for another week or 2, his recovery already exceeding every medical projection. His dress whites were impeccable. His bearing was the kind of calm that comes from having survived things most people can't imagine. He looked at Laura for exactly 3 seconds, then looked at the medals on the table, then looked back at Laura. When he spoke, his voice carried the precision of military ritual. "Navy Cross for Valor in Sanjin," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Silver Star for extracting 5 wounded SEALs under sustained enemy fire." He paused. 2 Purple Hearts. The kind of pause that means the speaker is rebuilding their own composure. "She's the combat medic who saved my life when my convoy was hit 7 years ago. And she just saved it again 3 days ago when I crashed in the ICU. She's the one I got the tattoo for. The one they told us didn't make it home." His voice cracked on the last word. He stopped. Breathed. Continued. "Senior Chief Bennett is the reason I'm alive. The reason 5 other men are alive. The reason I've had the last 7 years at all." A man in a dark suit stood from the corner of the conference room where he'd been silent up until this moment. FBI credentials. His name was Agent Morris, his voice the kind of flat that comes from having delivered bad news professionally for 20 years. "Dr. Hargrove's fraud has been under investigation for 8 weeks, he said, opening a folder that contained 18 months of billing records, equipment orders that never existed, procedures billed to Medicare that were never performed. We needed one piece of evidence to connect him to the vendor he was taking kickbacks from. One piece that would make the financial motive clear." Agent Morris gestured to the medals on the table. "Senior Chief Bennett's careful documentation of supply discrepancies gave us that piece. Once we connected the dots, board member Hancock provided testimony in exchange for immunity. The HR director has admitted to fabricating the performance complaints. We have 3 other nurses willing to testify about Dr. Hargrove's pattern of harassment." The door opened again. Dr. Hargrove filled the doorway like something that had been drained of all its confidence. His face was the color of dishwater. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume. "I don't understand," he said, his voice the voice of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Patricia Chen's voice was steady as a surgical laser when she answered. "You're under investigation for Medicare fraud, Dr. Hargrove. You're under investigation for creating a hostile work environment. And you're being terminated effective immediately." She paused. "The board member you called? He's already given his deposition. The kickback scheme is documented in 18 months of wire transfers." Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at Laura. That was his mistake. That moment of eye contact. Because in that moment, the timid nurse he'd mocked in the cafeteria was gone, replaced by someone whose composure had been forged in sandstorms under gunfire, someone whose hands had held lives together while mortars fell around them. Laura's eyes held no anger. They held no triumph. They held only the absolute certainty of someone who'd already survived far worse than Dr. Hargrove could ever inflict. The security guard entered, Marcus, the same man who'd escorted Laura out 3 days earlier with her cardboard box of personal effects. His face carried a kind of quiet satisfaction as he approached Dr. Hargrove holding an identical cardboard box. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," Marcus said. His voice suggested he'd been waiting 3 days for this moment. Hargrove took the box with shaking hands. He turned toward the door. No one in the conference room moved. No one spoke. The silence lasted exactly long enough for everyone to understand that an era had ended. 6 months later, Laura Bennett stood in Oak Creek Memorial's main auditorium wearing her Navy dress uniform, the ribbons on her chest telling a story that most civilians can't read but every veteran in the room recognizes instantly. The Bronze Star first. Then the Purple Hearts. Then the Silver Star, with its silver oak leaf cluster visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. And last, the Navy Cross, the highest military decoration for valor that can be awarded to an individual below the rank of flag officer. The chief nursing officer, Patricia Chen, presented Laura with the position of Director of Emergency Medicine, her voice thick with emotion as she acknowledged the hospital's failure to protect Laura and their commitment to do better. The auditorium was packed. Hospital staff in the rows behind a reserved section. local veterans organizations filling the middle section. And in the front row, a dozen Navy SEALs in dress whites, Commander Reeves seated among them with Laura's name still visible on his forearm, a tattoo that meant something completely different now. Meant everything different now. Daniel sat beside Reeves, 17 years old and visibly proud, no longer carrying the burden of his mother's secret. Laura's acceptance speech was brief, her composure maintained through one measured breath. "I've learned that true character isn't what you display when everyone's watching," she said, her voice carrying to the back of the auditorium with the kind of projection that comes from training to be heard across a medevac helicopter rotor wash. "It's what you do when the lights go out. When no one would know if you walked away." Her eyes found the faded unit patch, now framed and mounted on the wall behind the stage, no longer hidden inside her jacket but displayed as part of the hospital's commitment to hiring and protecting veteran medical staff. When she finished, the applause sounded like rain on a tin roof. After the ceremony, Reeves approached with his wheelchair, now just a precaution rather than a necessity. "Senior Chief," he said formally, then grinned. "I knew I recognized you in the ICU. I told them the morphine wasn't that strong." Laura's response carried the dry humor of someone who's been through fire. "You were dying, Commander. Again. You really need to stop making that a habit." He laughed, then serious, "The tattoo. I got it because they told us you didn't make it out. Classified casualty. I wanted to remember the medic who refused to leave us behind." Laura touched his shoulder, her hand steady. "I made a promise to get you home, sir. I don't break promises." Outside the hospital, Marcus, the security guard, now head of veteran services for Oak Creek Memorial, walked with Laura toward the parking lot where the Portland evening light was turning everything gold. Someone had keyed her car with the word hero, painted carefully in letters that took hours to create. But this time it wasn't vandalism. It was gratitude, made by a Marine she'd treated in the VA waiting room who'd recognized her from the news coverage. Laura ran her fingers over the letters, allowing herself one tear that she wiped away before climbing into her car. As she drove past a strip mall on Portland's east side, she saw Dr. Hargrove sitting at a folding table with a banner reading "Supplemental Insurance, Ask Me How." His expensive suits were replaced by an off-the-rack blazer. His confident smirk was replaced by the desperate smile of someone cold-calling strangers. Laura didn't slow down. Didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge him. She simply drove toward home, toward her son waiting there, toward a life she no longer had to hide. The radio played. The rain had stopped. Her uniform hung in the back seat, the medals catching occasional light from passing street lamps like small beacons of a truth that could finally be told. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you have revealed Laura's service to save her? Or would you have stayed silent to protect your family? The answer tells you something about who you are. Thanks for watching.